Welcome to this video on soldering. So we're going to start by bending some resistors in two different ways. So we've just got the standard way and our second way. So depending on how small you need the footprint to be on your circuit, you can use both options. We're going to begin soldering here by adding a little bit of solder to our iron, which is going to tin the tip. And then as we bring our soldering iron in on one side, we're touching the leg and the pad, and then we bring the solder in on the other side. Now we'll play that again, and so you can kind of see that the solder starts to ball up, and then it reaches a point where it will flow down and make a conical shape around the leg and the pad, and that's what we're looking for. So you can kind of see that as we do this on the second side where there's more contact, it happens a little easier. Once we've done that, we can trim the legs to tidy up the circuit. You don't want to trim it all the way down to the ground, just leave a nice little bit there. When we're doing multiple pins in a row, it can be good to solder every second one and then come back and do each of the others. That way we kind of spread out the amount of time that, say, an IC will be in contact with the soldering iron and reduce the chance of overheating components. You can see here an example of poor soldering. So I'm adding way too much solder here, deliberately to try to make a bridge across the connections. And so we can then come back later and pull our soldering iron through and clean that up. There's still too much solder, so we use what's known as a solder sucker, where we heat up the soldering iron, and then there's a little vacuum triggered pump that we can pull the solder off. Another tool that we have, though, is called solder braid, and it has flux in it that allows the solder to flow, and so we heat that up on top of the solder, and it pulls the solder into the braid. And so you can kind of see here, as we heat it up, then it will sit down and then pull all of the solder in. So now we'll go through the circuit that we'll be making in the class today. So we're going to begin by folding a resistor, and then we can put that into the PCB. So obviously the resistor is non-polarized, so it doesn't matter which way we go, and we can just bend out the legs a little bit to make sure that it doesn't fall out. We're then going to bring our soldering iron in from one side, heat up the pad and the leg, bring the solder in, take the solder out, and then take the soldering iron out. So we can do that again, a little closer. It kind of balls up, and then we'll sit down into the pad. So again, another close-up, bringing the soldering iron and the solder in from opposite directions. I'm just kind of cleaning up a little bit here. So here is an example of a bad solder joint. You can kind of see how it puckers around the pin leg. So I've added just some heat to it again, and we get this nice conical shape, which is what we're aiming for. It should be nice and shiny. So this is the board after we've installed all of the resistors. All right, and now we'll move on to installing the LEDs. Pay careful attention to the LEDs and make sure that the short leg is on the outside of the PCB. So we can see here I've put in all of the LEDs, and I'm just going to go along one by one and bring the soldering iron in from one side and the solder in from the other, and solder one pin from each of the LEDs. The solder is quite flexible, and so you can manipulate it and bend it around to give you a nice angle. So you can kind of see the amount of time that you can be spending on each solder joint. So the soldering iron in, then the solder in, the solder out, and then the soldering iron out, and that will give you nice solder joints there. As we do this, sometimes we will end up bumping the components or misaligning them on the other side of the PCB. So in this next clip that's coming up, I'm holding the component on the top, and then I'm going to bring the soldering iron in so that I can then heat up the joints and make sure that the LED is then vertical in its placement. Following on from this, we're going to install our Arduino stackable headers. Start by soldering a single pin of them, and then use the same process to make sure that they are vertical, otherwise they won't fit into the Arduino. So you can kind of see here, after I've done one of them, I'm then moving along through the rest of the pins. You don't need to do every second pin and then come back through, because we don't have electronics connected to it, but it's up to you. Either option is fine. Following on from here, we're going to install the jumper pins, and then we can put the jumper headers on top of that. You can see that in these couple of photos with the jumper pins and then the headers on top. At this point, the board is complete, so you can upload your Arduino code to it and make sure that it functions correctly. So from here, you want to grab some perf board, some resistors, some capacitors, and just practice soldering. Once you feel comfortable, move on to soldering the kit together, and then you can show me that as your assessment piece. So let me know if you have any issues.